That's really interesting. And what I heard a few times there is that the lens has changed from what is best for the world, i.e., climate change, in terms of its impact on people, to its impact on the corporation and the firm, which makes sense if you do look at it from a corporate lens. Obviously your concern is going to be, what is this going to do to our firm, and how do we mitigate it? But as we move on and people become more and more aware of these issues, um, they do want to create a positive impact. So, for instance, in the investment community, investors are very focused on investing in products that meet their ideals, um, that they feel will actually do some good in the world. And so we have all these funds out there with, high ratings, and this is a super ESG friendly fund. This one is not. This stock has a high ESG rating. This one doesn't. And I personally have found the rating system to be a bit confusing, where I do question why certain firms have the ratings that they do and other firms don't. So I'm hoping you guys can shed a bit of light on ESG scoring, like what is happening, and why, is for instance, an oil company, a gas company, have a high ESG rating.
Yeah, I'll take a bit of that. I think the requirement that these services have in front of them is to rate every public company. So when you're rating thousands of companies, almost by definition, you can't look through the statistics to what's really going on underneath, and that's the job of the investor to do that. We see a corollary exactly from what happened with Moody's and S&P in the financial crisis, right? They wanted to rate every single debt security in the world, and they rated a bunch of them AAA. And investors who would simply follow the rating might find themselves in deep trouble, as these things were clearly not quality investments. So here you have the same kind of situation where these rating services want to rate every company in the world. So they look at a lot of different factors, but you get an A or a B, a yes or a no, a binary rating if you have a committee on this, if you have a policy on that. What the company actually does with that policy, they may not disclose. It may be tough to really understand, right? So it's the job of the investor to look through these ratings, because there are a lot of companies that on one service they're rated highly as a good ESG, candidate, and by another rating service that's looking really at the same things with a poor rating or a below average rating. And you don't get, as an investor, necessarily any transparency as to what the weight of the different characteristics are when you aggregate them up to a final score. You don't get that kind of transparency. It's a black box. So I think the more thoughtful people are getting beyond the ratings, and they're looking at the impacts of these companies. That's what I'm doing at Twin River, is trying to understand what are the positive impacts of the products and the services when they're released out into the wild. What difference are these companies actually making? Is it an education company? Is it a clean tech company? Is it a healthcare company that's products and services are really doing great work? And you can measure that, and you can measure the actual difference they're making. Sort of get to the data, move beyond the scores, get underneath the scores and the ratings to the actual metrics themselves, the raw data.
Right. The reason I asked that question, and why I've been thinking about this for the past little while, is because of Elon Musk. He's a very active Twitter user, and you'll find headlines from him pretty much every other week talking about this. And he was upset with the rating that Tesla received, and that did make me pause and question. Tesla is considered to be one of a very green company. They've pretty much revolutionized the way we use transportation, and so I would expect a company like Tesla to have a higher rating, for Elon to be happier with that. But he's saying that his firm is being treated unfairly, um, and so is there truth to that? Like, what do you feel is happening in that situation? I understand your point, and it makes complete sense that these agencies have thousands of companies worldwide. Everyone needs an ESG rating because ESG is very popular. Everyone wants to know what the rating is, and so there is a sense of there's just too much to do, too little resources. But when you have like large companies that really stand out, and when they feel they're not being treated fairly, I do wonder what might be happening over there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big company, and no company is perfect, and there's a lot of pros and cons with every company. You have to net it out to what difference is that company making in the world and what's important to you. If you are doing wonderful things on the environment, but at a great human cost, and or non-direct environmental cost, then what's the net to you as the investor? You have to figure that out and do the work, right? So he may be upset with his single rating on his company. I would argue that any single rating on any company is something that people should be upset by because it can't capture really the totality of what's going on in a large complex company. So the company is doing a fantastic job at moving forward, the electrification of transportation, but the governance is questionable, and other parts of their company is questionable, and it's up to you, the consumer, to educate yourselves on those nets and what's really important to you, and then and make your decision in that way, and communicate that if you have clients. If you're investing for other people, it's not your money; it's a sacred trust, and you have to communicate, and you have to be accountable for those decisions to your clients, who are who are ultimately the reason that you're managing money for them.
Mm. I mean, to just pick this up, Eric,
Yeah.
The interesting debate I find about, for instance, electric car is that nobody looks at the life cycle environmental impacts of producing battery, lithium mining, all that kind of stuff. That is not talked about, and that just I say this not as an epiphany, but reflecting again that all these questions companies face come from society, with the level of information we have, with the level of attention we pay to certain things at a certain time. And that makes, of course, all these rankings and ratings very, very subjective. A number of my graduates here work for Sustainalytics in Toronto, and they can tell you stories about the complexity of grasping and reflecting these things, because ultimately these ratings reflect investor preferences. And that's a very old debate. We had that in the early 1990s when the FTSE for good in London, for the London Stock Exchange, and the Dow Jones Sustainability Index were set up. And they had just different philosophical approaches. The FTSE said some companies are never going to be on our index. Nuclear power was a big thing, and other industries. Whereas the Dow Jones said, no, life is life, and there are companies who do fossil fuels and who do all sorts of other things, which not all of us may agree are good, but what we do is we do a best in class. And so they have for every industry the best performers. Now these are fundamental philosophical differences, and I say philosophical not as a fancy term, but to describe that people have different expectations and aspirations, and that also translates to investors. And as long as we are so diverse as humans, rankings and ratings will be diverse too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Now, Eric, I think it's very interesting that you said investors have to do the research themselves and kind of dive into it. And I feel that's very fair because, again, relying on one number that's assigned to a firm and you don't know the exact metrics or how they came up with that number, while it may be convenient, it's probably not the best if you do genuinely, want your investments to make a positive impact on the world. Um, Now, I do wonder, how should advisors look at this? So, my background is in financial management. Obviously, I was an associate with an advisor where we invested assets for our advisors. We had our portfolios, and you know, I've noticed that in the last couple of years before I left, there was a shift where investors were increasingly coming and asking questions about ESG. they, or they would share things that they were passionate about, and they wanted, or sorry, shares that they were of companies that they were passionate about, and really ideas, and causes that they wanted to be involved in. Um, One example is clean water projects, right? And so they would come to us and be like, okay, how do I make a positive impact in this area? What should I invest in? What shares should I buy? So I do wonder, what resources or even approaches would you invest to advisors who have to create these portfolios, who have investors coming to them for this information? Because as we know, advisors have a lot on their plate. Unfortunately, not always the right amount of resources. And so, are there like any resources that you can point to?
I mean, there are fund rating services. Morningstar is a great example, and they recently took the fairly aggressive step of disqualifying something like 30% of the funds that had been labeled as sustainable as actually not qualifying for that designation. So the most important thing for an advisor to do is get beneath the label. If a company has labeled their fund as sustainable or ESG or clean tech, go at least try to get beneath that label. Look at what's in the portfolio. What are the top holdings of the portfolio? Or look at some more independent evaluation service to try to understand whether you can confirm what the company is saying about how it manages the money is actually coming through in the portfolio's holdings. Because they don't always align, and there are very high-profile examples of a big global bank in Germany and another big global bank in New York that have actually been taken to task by regulators for not actually doing what they say they do. So, I mean, the fact is we're on a journey here, and a lot of these labels and a lot of these practices are evolving and changing, but this kind of conversation and discourse is exactly what is needed to improve the level of the game. We're still debating regular financial accounting after over 100 years of it. And so to expect ESG measurement and ESG scoring and management of these portfolios to be perfect after, just a decade or two, I think is a little bit aggressive, but a lot of attention is being paid, and I think you're going to see great improvement, and the advisors are going to have a lot more help 5 and 10 years from now in understanding what really is authentically ESG than they do today.
The rating game is a really challenging game. I mean, people want a number, but they also want the detail behind the number. And the transparency of all of that detail is always a challenge for the rater, because that in some cases involves some proprietary approaches that they're using. So I think it's, as Eric was saying, it's important to understand what's behind the number and the criteria that were looked at. So Corporate Knights, for example, rates and ranks the 100 largest publicly traded companies on the planet as to how sustainable they are. And they every year put out a global 100 list. What's really impressive is that you see all the detail behind that. They started off with about 14 criteria. They're up to 21 now, and they cover all the bases: environmental, social, governance. And you can see the way in which these companies scored on each of them. So you've got the detail behind it. So as you say, if you want to know how they're doing on water, you can see how they're doing on that particular indicator, that particular criteria, that KPI. And that's where the ratings are really helpful. You get an overall number, but you can see the detail behind it. If you can't see the detail behind it, it's kind of useless. So Sustainalytics goes through the same kind of challenge of coming up with a single rating, but also being as transparent as possible about all of the data behind it. And I think that the thirst for scores, the thirst for ranking and so on, sometimes gets us into unfortunate situations where we're just looking at one thing. So when you mentioned Tesla before, their product may be pretty sustainable other than the life cycle implications of the batteries and so on. But the company, as a company, how is that being run, governed? How is it being governed? How do they treat their employees? How do they treat their communities and so on? So is if that's important to you as an investor, you want to know that information. So having the backup behind the ranking, I think, is more important than the ranking.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think there has been a shift towards that because, as we've been discussing, people are no longer just accepting that number. Well, the number is very convenient and it's easy and everybody wants it, so they have an idea of at least where to start, or a general guidance of, okay, this company is in the right area, this one is not, based on ranking. Um, there definitely is more of a move towards research, but I think the issue is, where do I start? What resources are available for me to go and start evaluating these firms? And that can be a difficult process depending on the information out there, but also because there's so much information that you don't know where to start. But yes, Dirk.
I think Eric has made the point. It's a young field. Let's give it some time. And I see it from my end of the, um, the trade. We just got an endowment by a large Canadian bank for a chair in sustainable finance. That's just starting. There is a guy coming in who can contribute to develop these things. It's a new thing. And by the way, other rankings, think of the triple A ratings of all these bonds that led to the financial crisis in 2008, right? Ratings and rankings are not perfect, right? And this is a very new area. And yes, we need to develop the expertise and the criteria and make them robust and make them maybe even stronger. But I think it's an exciting journey that has started. Let's not forget this. This wasn't a conversation to be had 10 years ago. And so I look at it rather as some blossoming flower that needs to be watered, protected, and fertilized, rather than look at the limits and, of course, challenges that are still around. Yes.
But on some issues, we don't have that much runway. I mean, we don't have the luxury of taking forever to figure this out and be really rigorous about it. So I kind of applaud the efforts by the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC in the US and the CSA in Canada, to get stock exchanges to require listed companies to be more open about how they're doing on critical issues like climate change. So the effort by the SEC to require companies, as part of their Form 10K or whatever, to disclose how they're doing on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures factors, I think is really, really good. While we figure out all of this other stuff, at least give the investors enough information on critical issues that they can make a more balanced judgment as to whether they want to put their money into those companies or support them.
It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Bob. I've been there a couple of times over the last 15 years.